Your Gradle scripts are down here, and I'm going to go ahead and expand those out. Looking at this, you should see that there's actually two files named build.gradle. As an aside, the Gradle website actually has a pretty helpful guide that goes through what each of the lines in each of these files does. In this screencast, I'm going to go ahead and point out some of the most important concepts, but you can go ahead and read these guides for the full picture. Back in our project, I'm going to go ahead and open up this project build.gradle file. If I were to change the view here to the project view, I would see that the build.gradle file that I'm talking about is right inside the root dice roller folder, whereas the other build.gradle file is inside of the app folder. Alright, so let's actually take a look at this particular file. These two lines of code here define the repositories available for the entire project. Repositories are remote servers where any external code will be downloaded from, for example, Android libraries. This Google repository here contains core Android libraries maintained by Google. And JCenter is a large repository popular amongst open source publishers. Dependencies are external code, such as libraries, that your project relies or depends on. This here is the project-wide dependency block that specifies dependencies needed for your whole project. Now, Gradle is a generic build tool, so it doesn't automatically know how to build Android projects or Kotlin files, which is why these two dependencies are pretty important. This is where you can download all of the Gradle scripts for actually building Kotlin Android apps. These scripts are part of Gradle plugins, and these dependencies say which version of the plugins to actually download. You're going to see where those Gradle plugins are used shortly. Now I want to go ahead and take a look at that second build.gradle file, which is in the app folder. This Gradle file is responsible for configuring how to set up this app module. Okay, so let's go ahead and open that up. I'll go ahead and scroll to the top. Here at the top, we can see those plugins that I talked about before. These plugins are needed by Gradle to know how to build Android and Kotlin projects. Looking a bit lower, you can see the Compile SDK version, Min SDK version, and Target SDK version. These refer to the different OS versions that your app actually supports. Min SDK is the minimum supported version, and you pick this way back when you first made the app. Meanwhile, your Compile SDK version is the API version that your app is actually compiled against. So if you end up using features that were only released in version 28 and higher of the API, your Compile SDK version should be at least that high. Now, Target SDK version doesn't actually affect anything about how your app is compiled, but it does imply what versions you've actually tested your app on. If you set your Target SDK to 28 and your Min SDK to 19, that implies that you've tested your app on devices running from version 19 to 28. Generally, you should try to keep both your Compile SDK version and your Target SDK version to the most recent version of Android, which at the time of this recording is what we're doing here. The unique application ID is defined right here. The application ID is super important because it's the unique identifier that Android and Google Play both use to identify your app. For example, it's not possible to install two different apps on the same device that share the same application ID. It's also not possible to publish an app to Google Play with an application ID that has already been used to publish another app. Therefore, it's super important for this to be unique. And because of this, it's commonplace to use the reverse domain name that you or your business owns, followed by the name of the app. The logic being that only one company or person will actually have ownership over that web domain. Now, this course has a lot of example apps in it, and not all of you own web domains, so I'm using example.com here as that web domain. And when that's reversed, that becomes com.example. So that's the start of my application ID, and then I'm using the app name, Dice Roller, as this last part. Now, by default, this application ID will match the package of our app. So if I'm over here in my main activity, I can actually see that the package is com.example.diceroller. These defaults were chosen way back when we set up the project. Finally, if I scroll down, I can see this dependencies block here. These are all the dependencies that are needed for our app. Gradle will download these dependencies on our behalf from the repositories that we specified in the other project build.gradle file. Because we're going to be using and adding different libraries in the course, you're actually going to be editing this part of the Gradle script most often.